We just finished talking about the giant mayfly surges in that can happen, and it's this with this radar image from Wisconsin coming off of the upper Mississippi River. But massive hatches of aquatic insects are relatively common, and they just do this to sort of overwhelm their predators. They can just put so many out that there's no way that a predator could eat them. But many the emerging insects are really important food for fishes, as well as many terrestrial organisms, and particularly in areas like deserts where the birds will congregate around a few bits of water when the hatch comes out, and it's an important source of food as well as water. I also neglected to mention scale, but each of the legends has scales on them. And so pay attention to that. Even though the pictures are all the same size on your screen, they vary quite a bit. These mostly are running about a ½ centimeter to a centimeter on this particular image. And we see midge larvae in the upper left and A. They're quite diverse taxonomically, very difficult to identify with each other. And they can be very important and have really large numbers. We've seen some of these, the blood midges, both in the anoxic zone in streams and also in the bottoms of lakes. They're some of the only organisms that can deal with the anoxia in the lakes, and they have very high levels of hemoglobin. So when you pull them out with the atmospheric oxygen, they turn bright red. We also saw the phantom midge Chaobarus in Potawatomi State Lake number 2, which is a midge larvae that goes up and down the water column and is a predator of zooplankton. So they're pretty diverse. The cirriped fly larvae, dipteran, has a respiratory siphon. So this is one that can live in, basically sewage water. It can be in completely anoxic water and then stick that little siphon up and respire oxygen. C is mosquito larvae, and obviously global importance as far as disease and pests, but also a really important food source for a lot of organisms. And they're collectors that their larvae need water. D is the caddis larvae, Hydropsyche. So the caddis larvae, Ephemeroptera, the mayflies, Plecoptera, stoneflies, and the Trichoptera, the caddis flies, are indicators of clean water quality. So there's an index of water quality, and we'll talk about biological indices. EPT is one of those. Many of them build cases. There are species that spin nets, and so they sit in a stream and make a net, and then they collect stuff off of the net. And we don't have the Deep Creek Pillsbury Crossing field trip this year, but if you ever get out to Pillsbury Crossing, there's a waterfall there, and there's water running over a big sheet of limestone, and you can just see thousands and thousands of these little nets if you look really closely, and there's a caddisfly in each one of those. So you'll notice that most of these insects are found in aquatic systems as larvae, but some of them are also found as adults. So this is an adult caddisfly, obviously, that emerges, and people will tie flies to match that hatch and catch trout and things like that. But then some beetles, like these riffle beetles and hydropillid beetles and these coleopterans, the adults also live in fresh waters. And so they can have their complete life cycle associated with fresh waters. And this is a beetle larvae. We found, I think, one of those in Kings Creek when we were there. And as I mentioned in the question of the day, I was asked what one of my favorite insects is, aquatic insects, macroinvertebrates, and one of my favorites was the caddisflies, and that's because of they build these cases. They spin silk. They're related to silkworms and pretty closely related to the butterflies and the moths. and they use objects in the water to either create camouflage for them. If they're heavy shells that they create, they then sink, and so it keeps them on the bottom if they're in fast-moving waters. They can make spiral ones that almost look like snails, or straight ones. And then like these twig ones or these leaf ones, you really can't see them on the bottom of the stream very well until one of the leaves starts crawling across the stream, right? So I think this is a pretty neat adaptation, and you know, this nice, really well constructed case right here is quite impressive. So
So the one with shells, you're saying that's held together by the silk they make?
they collect shells and they lash them together with silk and make a little case that they get in.
Do they do that while the water's running really fast, or do they kind of have a construction site that they bring the shells back to?
They'll find them in the stiller areas where they won't be washed away. Yeah, and then as they get larger, they have to, you know, build new ones.
Cool.
Yeah, evolution is an amazing thing. One of the fun things that in the society I go to, there's people that actually make jewelry out of these, and so they'll collect the larvae and put them in with flakes of gold, or, you know, different things like that, and they'll build their cases out of it, and then they'll hatch and they'll let them go into the wild, back into the wild, and pull the case and fill it with epoxy and put a earring or a necklace holder on it. So there's some jewelry that people make using this. You can find it, you know, at an Etsy too, but it's kind of an in kind of jewelry.
Would it just be called caddisfly jewelry, probably?
Yeah, that's basically what they'd call it. So, yeah, so you know, Google it and see. It's pretty cool. Okay, so we're gonna move into the crustaceans, and here's a series of crustaceans that we can find in fresh waters. The copepods are some of the fastest swimming organisms by body length, actually, and they have a series of nauplear stages here, and go through, I think, like 12 different stages before they come into the adult. And the adults can be either predatory, parasitic, or collectors. They can be grazers. They're very diverse. In the marine system, you can get really large ones that are parasitic on whales, and so they really have a huge variety of different kinds of adaptations. But most of these are microscopic. You can see this one's 0.5 millimeter, and so just barely visible to the eye. This is one of the parasitic copepods here, and we have cyclopoid copepods. The calanoids have these really long antennae they use to swim, and then the cyclopoid ones have these shorter ones, and again, they're larvae that develop. There's another cladoceran here. Whoops. This one is similar to, we just talked about the phantom midge. It has a similar lifestyle, but it's a microcrustacean, Leptodora, and it's a predator in lakes, and it will go up at night when the sight feeders can't see it. It's pretty clear looking, and then it'll drop down during the day. So it'll eat these other copepods and the cladocerans. So the cladocerans are sometimes called the water fleas. Daphnia is a common one. Maybe they do a lab in enterobiology where they put it under a microscope and either put caffeine or nicotine or alcohol on it and see what happens to the heart rate. You can see the heart's beat. And you're just starting to get into an organism that's big enough to start needing some degree of a circulatory system. They don't have veins and arteries, but they do have a heart that moves stuff around inside of their body. They are an interesting organism in that their populations are mostly female throughout the year, and they really don't need males much until things get bad, and then they self-fertilize, and the young will burst out of their back. But when things do get bad, they create males and females who, when they mate sexually, the brood chamber turns into an amphibia, which is a resting stage that can sink down to the bottom of the lake and stay there until things get good. Sometimes they get buried and they can last 100 years or more down in there and then come back up and pop out. So they've been useful in some genomic studies. All of these things that we see here, for the most part, are planktonic, not benthic, but some of the copepods can be benthic. The ostracods here, also called the seed shrimp, are generally benthic, and this is one. It basically could not see it very well because this shell has been pulled off of this side, so you can see its body and its legs inside there. But if you see them actually alive, they look just like little microscopic shells, and they just with legs, little teeny legs sort of sticking out of the bottom, just these things sticking out of the bottom. They go around. They preserve fairly well in the fossil record and have been used by paleolimnologists and geologists and such to indicate prior conditions in both marine and freshwaters. Some people call them the ostracodes, other people call them the ostracods, and it just depends on where you learned about them, what your pronunciation is, but it's not very consistent. So these are the microcrustaceans. Oh, yeah, so this is Daphnia. Oh, no, it's a bosmine, I believe, but it's another example of cyclomorphosis. And this thing looks almost like a puppy or something, I don't know. But in any case, when they get exposed to fish predators, so they've got these big, their second antennae is actually a swimming appendage, and they jerk their way, swim through the water. Those are taken off here so you can see the body shape. As they get exposed to predators in successive generations, they get bigger and bigger and pointier to resist being eaten. So there's a number of different ways that organisms can avoid being eaten by others, and this is another example of cyclomorphosis. I had a student that worked on other species of daphne that grow in the reservoir here, and there were a couple of other responses to fish predation, one of which was to just make amphibia and drop out. Another one was to start reproducing much more quickly and at a smaller size. So they're just too small to be seen and effectively eaten by the fishes. So there's a whole variety of evolutionary adaptations. In addition, this is all just one species, right? So in this one, you couldn't use peaked helmet and smaller size rather than large rotund or something like that as a taxonomic criteria, because their morphology is quite different, even though it's the same species, and they've been reproducing clonally throughout the summer in this particular system. There's also more macro crustaceans, ones that are easier to see, and this one's a cave shrimp here. Crayfish, we see they're omnivorous and they're really common in fresh waters. Essentially, the freshwater shrimps and crabs have the same niche in tropical streams as the crayfish do in the temperate streams. So you'll more commonly see freshwater shrimps zipping around in tropical streams and then crabs. You'll also see many islands that have freshwater shrimps or crabs that have evolved just coming in from the ocean. So they're fairly recently come out of the ocean. In addition to that, B is an isopod, and they also have many marine examples. And this is a Saechiodotia. They can be quite common in streams, but also this is the same as that very initial blind isopod that I showed you. Well, it's behind me right now in the image from the caves, but they also there are species that are adapted to being in streams and bottoms of lakes and such. And the difference between the isopods and the amphipods, in just crudely, is that the isopods are dorsal ventrally flattened. So this is from the top, whereas the amphipods are laterally flattened. So this is from the side. These are also sometimes called the scuds or the side swimmers. They can be very abundant in streams. And Acellus is one of the genera that the Europeans have studied a whole lot. And then there's, in D is is an opossum shrimp. It is another crustacean that is predatory and goes down during the day and up during the night. This one is one that's been that's native to Northern Europe, but got pushed out of North America in the glaciation at least. But many managers dropped it back into lakes, stocked it in, thinking it would boost fish production. Based on some fairly unusual examples where the currents brought them up from the bottom during the day, they actually outcompete the fish in a lot of systems that are sort of catastrophic for food webs, and we'll talk about that in future classes. So these are getting up in the centimeters to multiple centimeter planks. The crayfish is 10 centimeters, so it's pretty good sized one. There's some really big ones. The yabbies in Australia are like this big. There's some really good sized crayfish. And then there's a lot of freshwater shrimp culture in Southeast Asia, where they're actually an aquaculture species that's used. And the last group is the chordates, the vertebrates. And I really don't cover that much in this class. We'll talk about them, but people have had so much exposure to fishes and amphibians and the birds and reptiles and mammals that associate with freshwaters. They know many of them. We'll talk about some specific examples as we move through the class.